Hey, what's up, Unbroken Nation? Hope that you're doing well wherever you are in the world today. I'm very excited to be back with you with another episode with my guest, Tom Dozier, who is a behaviorist who has researched and provided treatment for misophonia as a reflex behavior condition since 2012 and is a pioneer in misophonia research. I particularly am very excited about this episode because it harkens some memories for me as I've been thinking about and digesting what we're about to talk about. So, Tom, first and foremost, thank you for being here, my friend. I would love if you would just take a moment, introduce yourself, and tell the audience how you got to where you are today.
Okay, so my first career was as an engineering manager. I did that for 30 years. I was looking for something to do for the rest of my life because I don't sit around. Like to keep busy, so I went back to school in behavior science and became a behavioral parenting coach, teaching parenting classes and such. And I had a mom of a kid with misophonia contact me for help, and her daughter had this unknown hearing disorder that was going to ruin her life. But she had auditory, visual, and olfactory triggers. So I go, well, that can't be a defect in the hearing neurology. That has to be a reflex condition. Well, as a behaviorist, we have reflexes, feelings, and emotions. That's kind of one class of behavior. And then we have the stuff we do, the math and talking and walking and all the doing stuff. And I thought there's research to help with this. And so I just said, hey, I'm going to go look at this and look at the problem to be solved. And when I went on to Google Scholar of all the journal articles and searched for misophonia, there were three hits only at that time. And I recognized my daughter had this condition. And I thought, hey, let's go look at this and see what we can find. And that's what took me to where I am now. So I say my primary career is a behavioral parenting coach, but 90% of my time is on misophonia now.
So, Tom, I think the best thing to do would be to start with this. What is misophonia?
So, kind of a common understanding of misophonia is that a person hears some sound like chewing or sniffing and has this intense negative emotional reaction. That's kind of the fundamental, non-technical definition. And by the way, it's not just things you hear. It could be seeing something like somebody twirling their hair or shaking their legs, but there's just a really innocuous stimulus. It's no big deal, normal everyday stuff. And you just go, oh, I can't stand that. And so that's basically what we recognize as misophonia. It is quite common. It affects probably 10 to 15% of adults in the United States. It typically begins in childhood with the average age of in the 7 to 12 range, but it can begin at any time. It can begin as a grandma or grandpa or something. So it's this, again, extreme negative reaction to common sights and sounds typically.
Are there specific triggers around this?
Yes and no. So how about that for a definite answer? So it's known, like the subtitle of my book, Understanding and Overcoming Misophonia. The words I have on the cover, it says, does the sound of others chewing fill you with rage? So chewing, eating, mouth sounds is by far the most common. And a large survey I conducted over 1,000 people, 96% had eating auditory triggers. But that means that there's 4 or 5% of the people who don't. So it's not that you have certain sounds. Every person has a unique set of misophonia triggers. One person may trigger to the sound of chickens squawking or roosters crowing, and another person may be triggered by the sound of somebody clearing their throat or sniffing. So there's common sounds. mouth and nose sounds are by far the most common.
My first thought to that is why? Because we all make those sounds, right? We all do the sniffle. We all do the weird phlegmy cough. We all, on occasion, while we probably shouldn't, chew with our mouth open. Like, what is the in our? I guess really the thing that I want to start with is, where does that emotional and physical response like come from?
Okay, that's a great question. And the brain stem, I like to call it your lizard brain, that just reacts to the world around you. It just does these reflexes. It's watching you. It's always watching, and it's looking for a pattern. It's looking for a sound and something happens in your body. It may be for babies, for example. Mom talks to the baby, picks them up, talks to the baby, picks them up, says, "Oh, honey, sweetie, I'm going to pick you up now," and picks them up. And they do that 10 or 15 times. And that brain stem notices that la, 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 la voice goes with, ah, relaxing. Well, that's Pavlovian conditioning. And so with misophonia, I hear the sound of my brother chewing and I go, "He's not supposed to be doing that," or "That's not fair," or "Why did mom yell at me but it's not yelling at him?" Sound, thought, action. Sound, thought, action. And the lizard brain picks it up. And so then it's sound reflex. So what happens is this physical reflex develops so that essentially you hear a stimulus or see a stimulus and your lizard brain tasers you somewhere. And I'm gonna well, I don't have my rubber band. I'm missing my prop here, but essentially when you hear here we go. So if it's like crunch and you get zapped someplace, crunch, and that zap, that physical zap, then triggers the emotional explosion and the intense negative emotions. So fundamentally, at its base, it's this physical reflex problem from a normal brain. So I love the fact that this is unbroken, because people with misophonia, their neurology is not broken. It's normal adaptive learning by the brainstem, and it's called Pavlovian conditioning. And then once that physical jolt develops, then it's very natural that the negative emotions spin out of control on it.
The thing that comes to mind that I'm really curious about is this conditioning somehow tied into a survival mechanism? Like, what purpose does this? Because here's why I'm asking this question. Because I distinctly remember moments of time in childhood where if my brothers were chewing, I would want to punch them, and sometimes did, Tom, for full clarity, in the face, because it's the hardest thing to. And one of the, like, I'm now like flooded with all these memories. Like, one of them also is like my brother brushing his teeth. Like, the way he brushed his teeth made me insane. What is, like, what function, what purpose is this about? Survival? Is that, like, what service does this have for you in a practical sense?
Well, Michael, the Pavlovian conditioning, let's just not take this particular thing, but Pavlovian conditioning really allows us to adapt to the world around us. So, for example, with food reflexes, if you eat a plate of spaghetti, then your blood sugar spikes and your brain has to make all this insulin to bring it back down. Well, after a while, your lizard brain sees that pattern, and the waiter puts a plate of spaghetti in front of you, and before you start eating, your little lizard brain, as I call it, starts producing insulin so that your blood sugar actually drops a little bit and then raises up and then comes down. So we're smoothing it out. So it's really a way of adapting to the world. And so whenever that little lizard brain of yours sees a situation and an action situation, action, or stimulus, action, stimulus, action, it goes, oh, I can do that for you. Therefore, you don't have to think about it. Therefore, you can react faster without thought. And it's a survival mechanism. Pavlovian conditioning is a survival neurological mechanism. But in this case, it's an accidental reflex that strengthens with more experience. And so it's kind of gone out of control. But I don't think that in and of itself, reacting to people chewing has any survival mechanism, nor do I think it comes from the caveman days when, you were fighting for, hoarding your food and fighting for your food and everything. This is just really simple normal human neurology.
What kind of activity is happening in the brain when this is transpiring? Because to me, I've always thought about this idea of mindset and controlling your thoughts, and understanding now that it is conditioning. I think I can look at that and go, well, of course that makes sense why when somebody does that thing, I have that response. But what is actually happening in the brain that drives that response?
So we know that the brainstem, the autonomic nervous system, which I call the lizard brain, is the heart and soul of any Pavlovian conditioning, right? That's the part of the brain that hears the sound, notices the sound, looks at the situation and the context. It depends on not just the sound, but where you are and who's doing it. And it has to go up to the top brain, to the cerebrum, and say, where am I? What's happening? What's expected? Goes down into the motor cortex and rumbles around, and then it zaps the muscles. Now, that's the physical reflex that people do not notice. So, Michael, when you were a kid, and your brothers were chewing and brushing their teeth and making you so upset, did you notice that you were getting zapped, or did you probably just noticed you were getting upset?
Yeah, it always felt like instantaneous.
Upset, right?
Like, yeah, just like a trigger.
Okay. So what happens is from the time a trigger stimulus starts, from the time you start hearing that crunch sound to the muscles firing wherever they are, and it's unique to every person, is about 200 milliseconds. And then that's fed up into deep in the brain, there in the cerebrum, there is an anterior insula, and that's the anterior insular cortex, the AIC, is a center for communication. So it gets all the external sensation and the internal sensation. So touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, muscle tension, body temperature, oxygen level, pain, whatever. So it gets all the inside and internal and external. And that relays out to some spots behind your eyebrows, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is an emotional reflex learning center that takes something that's neutral and turns it into like a smell of grandma's house. Hey, I'm at grandma's house. Or misophonia, that crunch sound is like, oh, that's horrible. And so that little spot relays back to the anterior insula, which is, by the way, right next to the limbic system, to the amygdala and the hippocampus. And it just drives down, boom, 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 into the amygdala and hippocampus. And it's just explosion of emotion. So probably by 0.3 of a second from the time you first hear that trigger, your emotions are just flying. But they're emotional reflexes. And it's made that way to help you react quickly. This little structure behind your eyebrows, again, it takes something that's neutral, a person's face, and it becomes, hey, there's my girlfriend, or there's my wife for me. Hey, there's my wife. And it creates a positive emotional reflex. So these things help us adapt to the world around us, help us respond quickly. And it's great. It's really good stuff.
What comes to mind is, are these then individual experiences? Are we predispositioned to be biased in any way to certain stimulus? How I guess the thing I'm trying to wrap my head around in this moment is what exactly determines whether or not an individual have a reaction versus another one. Because
Okay.
I know people listening right now are probably in this thing where like chewing food that never bothers me, but if you click your pin, I'm going to throw you out the window. Right. So,
Right.
so is there a cognitive biasy here? Like, how do the individual experiences play out in this?
So there's a difference between a sound that you hear and a misophonia trigger, because that's really a multi-sensory experience. You hear the trigger and then you're getting jabbed in your body somewhere. So it's a little bit like fingernails on a chalkboard, which is genetic, not learned. But people hear that screech and they go, "Oh, stop that. I can't stand that sound." And what they should be saying is, "Oh, stop that. I don't like shivering," because the screech makes most people shiver. And then they say, "I don't like that sound." So with misophonia, everybody who has misophonia has uniquely learned that their trigger responses. So, for example, my wife developed a trigger to the chicken squawking because she was concerned that the neighbors would be bothered, and that she doesn't want to bother the neighbors. And so she would hear the chickens squawking, not just clucking, but when they're all squawking at the same time, just right in front of her desk. She faces her chicken area. And she would have that thought, "Oh no, I hope the neighbors are not bothered." And she would hold her breath. So after a while, when the lizard brain saw that pattern and says, "Oh, Pam, I can do that for you." And now she hears the chicken squawk and her chest muscles go and lock, and she stops breathing. And then she has this very negative emotional response. Now, the negative emotions are probably ingrained as us as mammals, that it's called pain-induced aggression. If somebody comes up and pops you in the back of the head, you're immediately having this negative response. And so any kind of aversive negative stimulus causes an irritation, an anger, or an aggression response. So that part, the fact that it all develops to anger, is very common because we're mammals and it's part of our defending ourselves. But the individual sounds just depends on the person. So my wife developed it to the chicken squawking. Another man that I worked with as a teenager, he had anxiety. He had shared a room with his brother who had allergies, so he could hear his breathing. And he's laying there trying to go to sleep. And after 20, 30 minutes, he goes, "Oh, this is horrible." And he goes to the couch. But after that one night, every time he heard his brother breathe for the next 30 years, it triggered him.
Wow. That's fascinating to me because then I guess as a parlay to that, then was it all breathing that triggered him or just the association made with that person?
So your lizard brain um, is deals with a complex stimulus for a reflex. So it's not just the sound; it's the sound, the setting, who's there. Am I in the forest? Am I in my home? There's different contexts that change these reflexes. So, for example, I was working with a woman. We were doing some relaxation training. She was relaxing. She says, "Oh, just a second. I think there's kids playing behind my house." I said, "Oh, is that triggering you?" She goes, "Oh, yeah." She goes away. She comes back a minute later and says, "Oh, they're doing some repair work. It's not a problem. Let's continue." So when she thought it was children playing, it was a trigger. When she found out it was adults working, it was not a trigger.
Mm.
So part of this is getting the right context. And so one person, let's suppose this guy would trigger just to his brother. And so for a while, it probably was only his brother's breathing that triggered him. Now, he was probably then in another situation, a little bit stressed, noticed the sound that seemed similar to his brother. Lizard brain says that's close enough, and triggered him. In his case, his shoulders were coming up and triggered him. And so now it's spread from that specific sound of that specific person to that sound by other people in other places, and that's called a generalization of a reflex stimulus, and it can spread to similar sounds, other people, other places, and then it just starts to spread and spread and spread. And then triggers grow in two ways. First off, they spread that way, and then if there's a stimulus I'm noticing while I'm being triggered, then that stimulus becomes a trigger. So, for example, if I trigger to crunchy chewing, eating, and a person has a bag of chips and it's crinkle, crunch, crinkle, crunch, crinkle, crunch, the crinkle becomes a trigger. Okay. Or I can be in a completely different place and being a little bit of an anxious person, because, by the way, that helps you develop misophonia if you're a little bit aware of the world and anxious about things, and you notice somebody's twirling their hair or bouncing their leg, and then you develop misophonia reflex from scratch again, and that can be a different muscle. So if every time I hear chewing, my shoulders go up, and it'll always be my shoulders, it doesn't vary. Once it's set, it's always going to be the same. But then when I hear see somebody twirling their hair, I might clench my fists. The lizard brain might clench my fists, right? I don't. The zap, I call it the initial physical reflex. And one of the big problems here, Michael, with misophonia and understanding it is that if I brought 20 people like you that had misophonia now or once upon a time and said, describe misophonia to me, you're going to describe the emotions. The emotions are so intense that that's what you notice the most. And so most misophonia experts do not understand that misophonia begins as a conditioned physical flinch. And it's that flinch that drives the misophonia.
Man, that's so fascinating to me, Tom, because I'm sitting here and like in real time, I'm thinking about what my triggers are. And two come to mind. One particularly is people who walk hard. So if you have like hardwood floors and you're barefoot and it's just that dun, dun, dun,
Yeah.
that it's so fascinating, because I remember even just recently having a conversation with a friend who was over. I was like, why do you walk so hard? and they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, dude, if you walked any harder, you're gonna put a hole through this floor. And just being like, why does that upset me? It's so arbitrary. But looking at and understanding this reflexive conditioning, I go, well, wait a second. And from a trauma scope, going, you weren't allowed to walk heavy in my house as a kid. That would be problematic. So like noticing that and having this conversation in real time, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense to me. What I'm really curious about in the context of this is like, is there a how and why to how misophonia like may actually become worse? Because I found myself in certain moments of not getting to rage, because I feel like I've really learned how to control my reactions and not be reactive to things, but just getting like perturbed would probably be the word best associated with this. But I know that there are people listening. They're like, well, when my partner like clicks the button in the shower, like I want to freak out, and it didn't used to be so bad, and now it's really bad. Or when I'm at work and the boss closes his door, it makes me want to like go and do whatever, but it didn't used to be that bad. Is there something, is there a worsening of this that happens over time?
Yeah, and part of this is that to understand how Pavlovian conditioning actually works. So I tell people that your lizard brain, that's what drives your Pavlovian conditioning, is neurotic and insecure. It is always insecure, never confident. So it sees a situation, hears a crunch or whatever, and it tightens that muscle 20%, hits a 20% tighten to that muscle. And then it goes, oh no, did I do the right thing? And it watches that muscle. And if that muscle tightens just a little bit, it goes, I predicted correctly. I did it right. And if, however, I'm really annoyed because it's an annoying day and because I've been triggered several times or whatever problems, so I hear the crunch and the 20% hits and I go, oh, and I go up to about 80% on that muscle, the lizard brain, or even if I just go to 40%, the lizard brain goes, hey, I did the right thing, but I didn't do it hard enough. Next time, I'll do a better job for Tom. Next time, I will hit that muscle harder. Because your lizard brain always follows the rules. And every time it zaps you, it turns and it watches that muscle and says, did I do it right? And if you clench down on that muscle harder, it goes, okay, I'll go up a little bit next time. And so it just builds and builds and builds and builds. Now, that's the physical reflex that drives emotion. But the emotional reflex that's coming out of your ventromedial prefrontal cortex behind your eyebrows, it's also an emotional learning structure. So every time you have that sound and the little flinch, and you have a negative emotion, and you go, ooh, and then you go, ooh, and you give it more negative emotions that you hate it, then that strengthens the neurology coming out of these little spots behind your eyebrows. In fact, that and the AIC and the amygdala, the whole area is strengthened. It actually creates, strengthens the myelination, or the little fatty sheath that's on the neurons to make them run harder and faster. So with experience, you're supercharging your anger neurons and you're strengthening that reflex more and more and more and more intensely. And it just gets perpetually worse with normal experience.
And that feels like there is, I guess what I want to understand here is there a way to control that?
Yes.
What does that look like, Tom? Because I'm like, and because the reason I was hesitant asking the question, because I'm sitting here, I'm like, it's so autonomic, obviously, right? Understanding and looking at that you have to actually, what I'm guessing is mitigate the reaction risk by doing something earlier. Would I be wrong in that?
It's a really good statement. You're absolutely right in that. So if you know you're in okay, so let's talk about, we talked about how misophonia physical reflexes get worse, right? And how the anger gets worse. The more you have a situation in the anger, the more the anger kind of builds for the next time. Because your lizard brain is neurotic and insecure, you hear a crunch and it hits that muscle, and then it's watching. Now, if you were relaxed before the muscle flinch, and you just relax again, just keep relaxing, the lizard brain goes, oh no, I predicted incorrectly. I thought Tom was going to tighten that muscle, but instead it relaxed. I made an incorrect prediction about Tom's reflex. I will include that in my rules for how to zap Tom, how to help Tom, and I will start backing off. So in as little as 20 or 30 minutes, if you were just fully relaxed to that muscle, then that misophonia can just back down. So I do parent coaching. I worked with a couple whose 4-year-old was whacking kids at preschool. And this was really going well. And toward the end of our series for the son, I mentioned misophonia because it's so common. And this 40-year-old burly guy goes, oh, yeah, that's me. I'm like, you're kidding. He goes, no, I had this friend as a teenager who chewed so loud, I couldn't stand it. He says, and now my kids know it bothers me. They chew around me on purpose just to irritate me. And it drives me nuts. And we did some testing. His reflex was in his jaw. So he's clenching his jaw. His lizard brain was tasering his jaw. So I said, look, if you will just, since you're eating with your family, I said, if you will just relax your jaw during dinner time, it will drastically reduce your misophonia. Now, you can't relax your jaw and eat at the same time. So you have to eat before or after your family. He says, okay, I'll give it a try. Well, they went away, came back 4 weeks later for their last visit. The boy was doing great. I said, how's your misophonia? He says, oh, it's gone. So in less than 4 weeks, after having misophonia for more than 20 years, his misophonia was gone. So I said, well, how long did it take? And I'm thinking, what, a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, I don't know. And he goes, well, at first, 30 minutes. I said, 30 minutes? What do you mean? He says, well, I would just relax my jaw and I could feel that jaw flinching. And after 30 minutes, it just stopped. Now, there's something called spontaneous recovery of conditioned reflexes, which means that the lizard brain may have stopped zapping him in that moment because it saw him not tightening those muscles. But overnight, it says, maybe I should try that again. So the next night at dinner time, maybe his jaw would respond for 10 minutes and then stop. And then the third night, maybe 5 and 3 and 2 and 1, and then it just stopped coming back. So relaxing, which is totally not what you want to do when you're angry and you want to just punch somebody, or stop them, physically stop them. Relaxing your muscles in advance of the trigger is a great treatment for misophonia. Now, the problem is for most people, they can't just relax. We learn to relax our muscles as we learn to play a musical instrument or a sport with lots of practice. So our hands were very good at relaxing. Our jaws were very good at relaxing. Most of the shoulders were somewhat okay. Most of the rest of our body, if we say relax, we can't just relax those muscles. So I have an app called Misophonia Muscle Relaxation Training. Only Apple wouldn't let me put the fourth word there. So Misophonia Muscle Relaxation, which is a training, it's a free app, and it allows you to do muscle relaxation training to develop the skill and the neurological connections to relax your body muscles on demand. And so then relaxing when there might be a trigger will start to bring triggers down.
Is there how do I want to phrase this? When I think about cognitive behavioral therapy, right, is there any aspects of that where you're basically reconditioning yourself in real time by going through these practical steps of relaxation while being hit with the stimulus?
So I'll see if I'm answering your question. So with the relaxation, it is not cognitive behavioral. It is creating conditioning events or counter conditioning events that allow the reflex to come down. But there are a couple of cognitive behavioral aspects of misophonia that can really help. One is working on your anticipatory anxiety, because the more you're kind of on edge, worried that you're going to get zapped, get triggered, the more responsive you are. So trying to work on that anticipatory anxiety and breathe and relax and focus on other things and stop that heart rate coming up and the normal tension and such that you might get from anticipating getting zapped. That's a cognitive behavioral aspect. And then at the far other end of the response chain after a trigger, there's what goes on in your mind. How long do you think that's so unfair? That's so horrible. Don't they know? They know that bothers me, that triggers me. They know that upsets me. They don't care about me. I feel completely disrespected. And people will spin on a trigger for minutes or even hours until they get it out of their system. So trying to willfully, mentally shift your attention away from a trigger and focus on something that you can see, or the details. I've got this paisley tie on. If you looked at all the little marks and the shapes and everything, then that would be a way of reducing that kind of a reflex, that mental focus on it, because the longer you focus on that mentally, the more you're telling your brain, that was really important, remember it next time.
And that makes me think so much about this concept that I often come to, is that where attention goes, energy follows, right? Because you're shifting effectively where you're putting your energy, because we do get looped and we do get stuck in these behavioral patterns, and we do kind of go, oh, you're doing that on purpose. And like the reality is, generally speaking, most people aren't doing things on purpose to piss you off. Like
Right.
some, sure, I would imagine there's a percentage, but in general, your partner, your coworker, the guy at the gas station, he's not trying to ruin your day, but you get stuck in these loops and these patterns which lead to that. What I'm wondering here, Tom, is going kind of back to the beginning where we started, this initial research study that you did with 1,000 people. Were there any commonalities across the board that you noticed that might be indicative of how people end up having misophonia?
So there's a couple of things that change the probability of developing misophonia. Okay. Maybe you have the misophonia gene, and the misophonia gene was identified by 23andMe. And if you have that gene, you are about 18% more likely to develop misophonia. So let's just suppose misophonia affects 10% of adults. Then if you have that gene, the chances of you developing misophonia is 12% instead of 10%. So it's not a cause. It just makes you more likely to develop misophonia. It seems that people who have anxiety and worry about things are more likely to develop misophonia. I found when I talk with people about, especially with children and youth, but often I ask with adults, were you an emotionally sensitive child? And emotionally sensitive children are much more likely to notice something that's going to upset mother or father or break a rule, and therefore they're going to develop misophonia. Or they're a rule follower, which kind of often may be emotionally sensitive as well. And so if I know that the rule is to chew with my mouth closed and my brother is smacking his lips, well, then he is violating a rule, and oh no, he's violating a rule. And then that's going to cause me to develop misophonia. But there are a lot of people, that just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. I worked with this one man who was triggered by mockingbirds chirping. And he was in his early 30s, never had any misophonia. He had a pair of mockingbirds build their nest outside of his bedroom, his apartment bedroom, which sounds really cute to have these little baby birds outside my window. I just love that. No, the male mockingbird chirps 24 hours a day at certain times of the year. And that bird chirped and chirped and chirped and chirped, and he developed misophonia to that chirp. So although there are commonalities, people who have other psychological conditions are at least 2, maybe even 3 times more likely to develop misophonia. So people with anxiety, people being a perfectionist often contributes to having people develop misophonia. And then sometimes it's the strong-willed, tenacious, it's not fair, it's got to be this way. And that causes people to develop misophonia. So there's really a large number of things that kind of put a person in a situation to hear a sound, have a negative thought, and develop a physical reflex.
Hmm. So
And then the emotions develop, which is what the person recognizes, not the physical reflex.
yeah, and it almost sounds like just like, and this is not to be crass, Tom, it almost sounds like just being a human being, you have a likelihood of this occurring in your life.
Well, yes, absolutely you do, because it is caused by typical normal neurology. And if you, and it's more, it really only develops where there's a repeating sound. If you hear a sound once or twice, it's not going to become a misophonia trigger, because it's not, you may dislike it, but it's not going to be a trigger because you haven't had enough repetition for your lizard brain to make it into a physical reflex.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating and such a fun conversation for me because I'm like in real time, I'm just going to all these different things and I'm thinking about, okay, maybe I should get this app and I need to go and do this thing and let me try to figure out, all of it. And it's so fascinating. I'm super curious about it. Tom, tell everybody where they can learn and find out more about you before I ask my last question.
Okay, so um, I've there's two places you can learn about me. Misophoniatreatment.com, which is my professional website for misophonia treatment, and misophoniainstitute.org, which is my nonprofit that I set up for misophonia information and awareness. So those are the two places that people can go for good information on misophonia and misophonia treatment, because a lot of places will tell you we don't understand what misophonia is and there's no treatment. So that's just not true. The other thing, Michael, is I'm put up a web page on misophoniatreatment.com/unbroken, where people can go and get the free first half of my book, Understanding and Overcoming Misophonia. So there's a free download. I'm not going to ask for your email address or anything. You can just go and get it there. But I'm here to help people, and we really can make a difference. Some people, misophonia will go away. Probably most people, it's a chronic condition. You have to remember to relax when you hear those sounds, when you hear those footsteps, Michael. You need to just melt your body and let yourself relax, because that will make it go away.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Tom. And of course, we will put all of the links in the show notes. Tom, my friend, my last question for you is, what does it mean to you to be unbroken?
Well, from a misophonia perspective, I want to first say that having misophonia means that you don't have a defective brain. You're not broken with misophonia. People with misophonia think there's something wrong with their brain, that they get so upset by these sounds and nobody else does. And I tell people, it's not that you have some chemical imbalance in your brain. It's not that you have neurons that are misfiring or cross-wired, or some defect in your upper brain telling you that these sounds are going to hurt you, like caveman days or something, are going to hurt you. And the one thing I can guarantee is you're not being possessed by aliens, right? This is normal human neurology. And so, to me, being unbroken with misophonia is learning to relax, right? Learning to do something different, to focus away from it. That the more, Michael, I'm sure you've talked with other people about things like depression and anxiety, and I don't know for sure about PTSD, but the more you think about those things, the more you think that, oh no, I feel my heart beating. Maybe I'm going to have a heart attack. Maybe my heart's going to explode. And that just brings on a panic attack. So with misophonia, the more you focus away from it in those situations, that helps your lizard brain to calm down and move away. So I really think being unbroken with misophonia means you're going to take care of it. You're going to address it. You're not going to just pretend it's going to go away or hope it's going to go away. You're going to actually need to do something to take care of your misophonia, rather than jumping in and trying to panic in the moment. And with misophonia, if you decide, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to endure this sound until I stop reacting, you're going to get tough with it. Your reaction gets higher and higher and higher and higher. The reflexes strengthen. The more you can walk away when you need to, turn on a little noise. Adding noise to the world. If you have a partner their breathing sound triggers you, then get some good ocean sounds and rain sounds going, and you won't even hear them breathing. So with misophonia, don't endure it, because it will break you. So to be unbroken is to focus away, add a little noise, be strategic, and carry on with your life.
Powerful, Tom. And thank you so much for this, my friend. Even today, I'm just like, oh, there's so much I want to dive into this. And so I appreciate you being here. Unbroken Nation, thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, share, tell a friend. And until next time, my friends, be unbroken. I'll see you.
Thank you, Michael.